Jack Redmond wiped the sweat from his brow as the Montana sun beat down on his weathered face. At 58, the lines around his eyes had deepened, telling stories of decades spent under open skies. His ranch, nestled in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, had been his sanctuary for 15 years since he'd left behind his former life in Billings. The two-bedroom cabin he called home wasn't much to look at. Cedar siding grayed with age, a metal roof that pinged during rainstorms, and a wide porch that wrapped around the front where he spent most evenings watching the sun set beyond his property. To the east lay the reservation lands of the Blackfeet Nation, where Jack rarely ventured despite its proximity. "Come on, Scout," Jack called to his aging border collie, who trotted dutifully behind him as they made their final rounds for the evening. The modest herd of 36 cattle grazed peacefully in the lower pasture. They'd need to be moved to the north field tomorrow, another day of solitary work that suited Jack just fine. Inside the cabin, Jack lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table and prepared a simple dinner of beans, cornbread, and coffee. The quiet was interrupted only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling and Scout's contented sighs from his spot by the wood stove. Jack's life had found a comfortable routine. Rise before dawn, tend to the animals, maintain the fences, repeat. The radio offered occasional company, bringing news from a world he'd deliberately distanced himself from. As he washed his dishes, Jack's mind wandered to his earlier years, the rodeo circuit he'd ridden for almost a decade, the brief marriage that had ended when Sarah couldn't bear the isolation anymore, the construction jobs that had sustained him until he'd saved enough for this place. There were moments when the silence pressed in too close, but he'd learned to fill it with work. "What do you think, Scout?" "Another day done," he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Scout was getting old, his muzzle grayed, his movements slower. Jack tried not to think about the inevitable day when even this companionship would end. Before turning in, Jack stepped onto his porch for a final look at the night sky. The stars were brilliant, unobscured by city lights, a canopy of silent witnesses to his solitary existence. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of sage and pine from the surrounding wilderness. In the distance, he could make out the faint drumbeat from the reservation, some gathering or ceremony he knew nothing about. It was while standing there that Jack noticed something unusual on the corner of his porch railing. He approached cautiously, reaching out to touch the object. 3 feathers, 2 brown, and 1 with distinctive black and white markings, had been carefully placed there, bound together at the base with a strip of red cloth. Jack frowned, looking out into the darkness. He hadn't heard any vehicles approach, and his property was set well back from the main road. The reservation boundary was at least 3 miles east. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Only cricket songs answered him. Jack picked up the feathers, turning them over in his calloused hands. He wasn't superstitious, but something about the deliberate placement felt like a message. Not threatening, exactly, but purposeful. He took them inside, placing them on the shelf above his desk, where he kept his mail and ranch paperwork. That night, Jack's sleep was restless. His dreams were filled with unfamiliar faces, watching him with expressions he couldn't read. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, but with an unusual sense of expectation. Scout seemed to feel it too, staying close to Jack's heels rather than racing ahead as he typically would during their morning routine. As Jack stepped onto the porch with his first cup of coffee, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, a thin line of gold pushing back the night. Scout suddenly stood alert, ears perked forward, a low whine in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, squinting into the half-light. That's when he saw them, 5 riders on horseback, approaching his property from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. They moved at an unhurried pace, their horses picking a careful path across his land. Jack set his coffee down, straightened his shoulders, and descended the porch steps to meet them, uncertainty and curiosity mingling in his chest. The riders approached in formation, forming a loose diamond around a central figure. Jack could now see they were all men, varying in age, wearing a mix of modern clothing and traditional elements. Their horses were well-kept, muscular animals that moved with practiced ease across the uneven terrain. Scout remained at Jack's side, watchful but not alarmed. Jack stood his ground at the bottom of the porch steps, one hand resting on the weathered wooden railing. He wasn't armed. His rifle was inside, propped in the corner of the mudroom, but he didn't feel threatened, just wary. The group halted about 20 feet from where Jack stood. The central rider, an older man with long salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat braid, raised his hand in greeting. "Jack Redmond," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Jack answered, his voice rough from disuse. "This is private property." The older man nodded. "I am Robert Many Horses. We come from the Blackfeet Nation." He gestured to the others. "These are my brothers and nephews." One of the younger men, probably in his 30s, with sharp eyes that studied Jack intently, spoke next. "We've come to speak with you, if you'll hear us." Jack hesitated, then nodded toward the house. "I've got coffee on." It wasn't the response the men seemed to expect, but after a brief exchange of glances, they dismounted. They tied their horses to the hitching post that Jack rarely used, and followed him up the steps. Scout circled the newcomers once, then trotted ahead as if suddenly appointed host. Inside, Jack busied himself with mugs and the coffee pot, acutely aware of how unused to company his space was. The cabin felt smaller with 5 strangers filling it, their presence disrupting years of solitude. "You found our message," Robert said, nodding toward the feathers on the shelf. "Is that what it was?" Jack asked, passing around mugs of black coffee. "Not much of a message if I don't know what it means." The youngest of the group, barely out of his teens, looked surprised. "You don't know about eagle feathers, even though your grandmother was." "Michael," Robert cut him off with a gentle but firm tone. He turned to Jack. "The feathers are an invitation, a recognition." Jack leaned against the kitchen counter, studying the men who had arranged themselves around his small living space. "Recognition of what exactly?" "I keep to myself. Don't bother anyone." "It's not about bothering," said the sharp-eyed man. "It's about belonging." Robert nodded. "I am an elder in our community. My name, Many Horses. It's also yours, though you carry a different name now. Your grandmother, Elizabeth Many Horses, was my father's sister." Jack felt something shift inside him, like ground giving way beneath his feet. His grandmother had died when he was 12. He remembered her visits when he was young, her stories, the way she'd speak words in a language his parents didn't understand, but that had sounded like music to him. "That was a long time ago," Jack said carefully. "My family, we lost touch." "Some connections can't be lost," Robert replied, "only forgotten for a time." The oldest of the other men, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. "There's a ceremony tomorrow, the first since the government finally returned the sacred ridge to our people. The elders have been discussing who should attend." "And you thought of me?" Jack asked skeptically. "A man who's lived apart for decades?" "We thought of our blood," Robert said simply. "In our ways, you are an elder now too. Your life gives you that standing, even if you've walked a different path." Jack looked down at his coffee, then out the window where the sun had now fully emerged above the horizon, casting long shadows across his land. "I don't know your ways." "But they know you," Michael said earnestly, earning another quelling look from Robert. The sharp-eyed man spoke again. "When we were young, our grandfather told us about his sister's grandson, who rode horses like he was born to them, who understood the land in his bones. He said someday you might find your way back." "I didn't know anyone was looking for me," Jack said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Not looking," Robert corrected gently. "Waiting. There's a difference." A heavy silence filled the room. Jack felt the weight of their expectations, their certainty that seemed at odds with his life of deliberate isolation. Part of him wanted to refuse outright, to reassert the boundaries he'd lived within for so long. But another part, a part he rarely acknowledged, recognized something in these men that resonated with memories he'd tucked away. "The ceremony," Jack finally said. "What would it mean if I came?" As Robert explained the ceremony, a blessing of Sacred Ridge and a celebration of its return to tribal lands after decades of legal battles, Jack found himself listening more intently than he'd anticipated. The land had historical significance as a gathering place, and had been wrongfully taken through a series of broken treaties and questionable government actions in the 1950s. Our lawyers finally proved the paperwork was falsified, the sharp-eyed man, who had introduced himself as Daniel, explained. Took 20 years of fighting, but the federal courts acknowledged it last spring. Jack nodded, understanding the significance. Land was more than property. It was identity, history, continuity. Though he'd chosen isolation, he respected their fight to preserve what was rightfully theirs. I still don't understand what this has to do with me, Jack said, refilling coffee mugs as the morning light strengthened around them. Robert exchanged looks with the others before answering. When sacred land returns, we honor those who maintain connections to it. Through memory, through blood, through spirit. Your grandmother was a keeper of stories about Sacred Ridge. She carried that knowledge even after she married your grandfather and moved away. She used to tell me stories, Jack admitted, the memories surfacing slowly, about a high place where the sky felt closer. Michael's eyes widened. That's it exactly. The ridge sits above the valley and the wind speaks differently there, Jack finished, surprised at how clearly the words came back to him. She said you could hear the ancestors in that wind if you listened right. A smile spread across Robert's weathered face. You remember more than you think, elder brother. The title still felt foreign to Jack. I'm not an elder in your community. I haven't earned that. The oldest of the nephews, who had introduced himself as Thomas, spoke up. Age and blood give you standing. Participation earns you voice. They're different things. Jack moved to the window, looking out at his property, the land he'd worked alone for 15 years. His cattle would need moving today. The north fence section had a post that needed reinforcing before winter. His routine called to him, offering the comfort of the familiar. When is this ceremony? He asked without turning around. Tomorrow at dawn, Robert answered. It will last through the day. There will be a council meeting after, to discuss the management of the ridge lands going forward. Jack turned back to face them. I have responsibilities here. Animals that depend on me. Daniel nodded respectfully. We can send 2 young men from the reservation to tend your cattle for the day. They're good workers, ranchers themselves. The offer surprised Jack, practical help rather than just ceremonial insistence. These men understood the reality of his life, the genuine constraints he faced. I wouldn't want to impose, Jack said, falling back on politeness to mask his uncertainty. It's not imposition, Robert replied. It's community. Something you've done without for too long, perhaps. The word struck closer to home than Jack would have liked to admit. He'd chosen this solitary life after disappointments and losses had piled up, convincing himself that simplicity and isolation were preferable to the messiness of human connection. But there were nights when the silence pressed in too heavily, when Scout's companionship, loyal as it was, couldn't fill the void. I'll think about it, Jack finally said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the outright refusal he might have given even a day earlier. The men seemed to accept this, finishing their coffee in companionable silence. As they prepared to leave, Robert approached Jack directly. Whether you come or not, you should know this, the elder said quietly. Your grandmother never forgot you. Before she passed, she asked my father to watch for you, to remember that you were family even if distances grew. That promise passed to me. Today I fulfill it. Jack felt a tightness in his throat that he couldn't quite swallow past. I was just a kid when she died. My parents, they didn't keep up those connections. That wasn't your doing, Robert said. The choice before you now is yours alone. Outside, as the men mounted their horses, Daniel turned back to Jack. We'll come at first light tomorrow, if you decide to join us. If not, we understand. The invitation remains open beyond tomorrow. Jack nodded, watching as they formed up in the same formation and began riding east. Scout sat beside him, head tilted as if trying to understand the sudden disruption to their quiet existence. Alone again on his porch, Jack's gaze drifted to the distant hills, where Sacred Ridge must lie. Something pulled at him, not supernatural or mystical, but human. The tug of blood and memory, of stories half forgotten but still carried within him. He had decisions to make, preparations if he chose to go. But first, The cattle needed moving, and the fence needed mending. Jack returned to his routine, though his thoughts remained unsettled, caught between the solitary path he'd chosen and the unexpected doorway that had opened before him. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of familiar chores, though Jack's mind was far from the tasks at hand. Twice he found himself standing motionless in the middle of the north pasture, staring eastward toward the invisible boundary that separated his property from tribal lands. Scout would nudge his leg, bringing him back to the present moment. By late afternoon, Jack had moved the cattle, reinforced the fence post, and stacked additional firewood near the cabin. The physical labor usually cleared his mind, but today it only provided a backdrop for his churning thoughts. Inside the cabin, Jack retrieved a worn wooden box from the top shelf of his closet. He hadn't opened it in years, perhaps a decade or more. Settling at the kitchen table, he lifted the lid carefully, revealing the few mementos he'd kept from his earlier life. There were rodeo belt buckles, a faded photograph of his ex-wife Sarah, and beneath these, an even older envelope containing photographs his mother had given him after his grandmother's death. Jack spread these on the table with careful fingers, as if they might crumble at his touch. His grandmother Elizabeth stared back at him from these images, a dignified woman with intelligent eyes and a slight smile. In one photo, she stood beside a much younger version of Robert Many Horses, her nephew. Jack had forgotten this connection entirely, or perhaps he'd never known it as a child. Another photo showed Elizabeth holding Jack when he was perhaps 4 or 5 years old. He was wearing a small beaded bracelet that she had made for him. Jack frowned, trying to remember what had happened to that bracelet. Had he lost it, or had it been packed away somewhere during one of his many moves? The phone rarely rang at Jack's cabin. He kept it mainly for emergencies, so the sudden shrill sound startled him. He answered gruffly, surprised to hear the voice of Bill Hayden, his nearest neighbor, whose ranch lay 5 miles to the west. "Jack, thought you should know there's a bunch of folks from the reservation driving back and forth along the county road today," Bill said without preamble. "They're not causing trouble, just unusual activity. Thought you might want to keep an eye out, being closer to that side than the rest of us." Jack glanced at the feathers, still sitting on his shelf. "I know about it. They're preparing for some kind of ceremony tomorrow. Sacred Ridge was returned to them." There was a pause on the line. "That old dispute finally got settled, huh? Well, long as they stay on their side, I guess it's none of our concern." The words hung in the air, drawing an invisible line that Jack had long accepted, the separation between his life and the community to the east. But for the first time in years, he questioned whether that line was of his own making. "Actually, they invited me to attend," Jack said, surprising himself with the admission. Bill's laugh crackled through the receiver. "You? Since when do you socialize with anyone, let alone get involved in reservation business?" "My grandmother was Blackfeet," Jack said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of silence on the matter. "Elizabeth Many Horses. Turns out the elder who came to see me today is her nephew. My cousin, I suppose." Another long pause. "Never knew that about you, Jack. 15 years neighbors, and that never came up." "Never seemed relevant," Jack replied, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. He'd compartmentalized that part of his history, filed it away with other pieces of himself he'd chosen to leave behind. After ending the call, Jack sat at the table until darkness fell, the photographs still arranged before him like pieces of a puzzle he'd abandoned long ago. Scout rested his graying muzzle on Jack's knee, offering silent companionship. "What do you think, old friend?" Jack murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Should we break routine tomorrow?" The decision crystallized slowly as the evening deepened. Jack wasn't one for spiritual revelations or dramatic changes of heart. His was a practical mind that weighed options methodically. On one side, the comfort of his established routine, the safety of isolation, the simplicity of answering to no one. On the other, the pull of forgotten connections, the possibility of belonging somewhere, the fulfillment of a promise that had apparently been kept for him all these years. Before turning in, Jack set out clean clothes, his best jeans, a button-down shirt he saved for rare trips into town, the boots he'd polished but seldom wore. He filled Scout's food and water bowls extra full, knowing the dog might be alone longer than usual tomorrow. As he lay in bed watching moonlight create patterns on his ceiling, Jack realized he'd already made his choice, not from sudden sentiment or spiritual awakening, but from a simpler, more human place, the recognition that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again without cost. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Jack heard the approach of horses. He was already dressed and waiting on the porch, a thermos of coffee in one hand, the bound feathers in the other. Scout sat alert at his feet, sensing the importance of the moment. The riders appeared as they had the day before, silhouettes against the dawn. This time, they brought an additional horse, a sturdy brown gelding with a white blaze down its face. Robert raised his hand in greeting as they approached. "You've decided to join us, elder brother." Jack nodded, descending the steps. "I have questions. Things I need to understand." "As it should be," Robert replied with a smile. "The seeking of understanding is a worthy path." Two young men Jack hadn't met before dismounted and introduced themselves as the ones who would care for his cattle. They carried themselves with quiet confidence, asking specific, knowledgeable questions about his herd and property. Jack found himself impressed by their practical approach, and some of his concern about leaving his responsibilities eased. After giving them instructions and thanking them for their help, Jack turned to the extra horse. It had been years since he'd ridden regularly. His work around the ranch was mostly done on foot or with his old pickup truck, but some skills remained in the body's memory. "This is Thunderbird," Daniel said as Jack approached the gelding. "He's steady and sure-footed. He'll carry you well." Jack took a moment to familiarize himself with the horse, running his hands along its neck and speaking softly. The animal seemed to accept him, standing calmly as Jack mounted with only a slight stiffness, betraying his years away from regular riding. Scout whined as the group prepared to depart. "Stay," Jack commanded, though it pained him to leave his faithful companion behind. The dog obeyed, settling onto the porch with watchful eyes. The journey east took nearly 2 hours at a measured pace. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed, fields giving way to more rugged terrain, scattered pine groves thickening into small forests that climbed the increasingly steep hillsides. They followed game trails and ancient paths that Jack would never have found on his own. Few words were exchanged during the ride. Jack found himself observing his companions, noting the easy way they moved with their horses, the respectful nods they exchanged with others they encountered as they drew closer to their destination. The sun was fully above the horizon when they reached the base of what must be Sacred Ridge. Jack could see people gathered ahead, perhaps 100 or more, arranged in loosely concentric circles around a central clearing. Some wore traditional dress, others modern clothing, but all turned to watch as Robert led their small group forward. "Many didn't believe you would come," Thomas said quietly to Jack as they dismounted. "There have been others of mixed heritage who turned away from invitations." Jack handed Thunderbird's reins to a waiting young man. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here yet." "Being present is enough to begin," Thomas replied. Robert guided Jack through the gathering. Eyes followed them, some curious, some welcoming, a few skeptical. Jack felt acutely aware of his outsider status, despite the blood connection that had brought him here. He stood straighter, drawing on the quiet dignity he'd observed in Robert's bearing. The ceremony began with speeches Jack couldn't fully understand. Elders speaking in the Blackfeet language, their words carrying across the ridge on the clear morning air. Robert occasionally translated key phrases for Jack, explaining the significance of reclaiming this sacred space after decades of separation. "This ridge has been important to our people for centuries," Robert explained. "From here, our ancestors could see approaching threats, track weather patterns, observe the movement of buffalo herds. But it was more than a practical vantage point. It was a place of connection to the land, to the sky, to those who came before." As the sun climbed higher, different parts of the ceremony unfolded: songs, prayers, the sharing of food. Jack was introduced to council members and family connections he'd never known existed. Some shared stories of his grandmother, filling in pieces of her life that had remained mysteries to him. "She was a keeper of our stories," an elderly woman told him, her eyes bright with memory. "Even after she married and moved away, She would return for the important gatherings, bringing what she had learned to the outside world and taking our ways back with her. Jack thought of the stories his grandmother had told him as a child, tales he'd eventually dismissed as mere folklore, but now recognized as attempts to maintain a connection to his heritage, a heritage he'd allowed to fade into the background of his identity. Standing on Sacred Ridge, watching the interaction of community members around him, their shared purpose, their interconnected lives, Jack felt something shift within himself. Not a dramatic transformation or spiritual revelation, but a quiet recognition. Isolation had been his choice, not his destiny. As the ceremony moved into its final phases, Robert approached him. "There's a place for you here, if you want it, elder brother. Not to leave behind the life you've built, but to add to it." Jack looked out over the landscape, his ranch visible in the distance. The reservation land spread before him, Sacred Ridge connecting them both. The boundary he'd perceived for so long seemed less defined from this vantage point. Perhaps it always had been. "I'd like to learn more," Jack said finally. "About my grandmother. About this place." He hesitated, then added, "About all of you." Robert nodded, satisfaction and understanding in his expression. "Then this is not an ending, but a beginning." As Jack stood on Sacred Ridge, surrounded by people who shared his blood, if not his experiences, he felt the weight of years of self-imposed isolation begin to lift. The feathers he still carried in his pocket, an invitation, a recognition, had opened a door he hadn't known existed. Whether he would step fully through remained to be seen, but for the first time in many years, Jack Redmond felt the possibility of belonging to something larger than himself. And that, perhaps, was enough for today.